Chapter 16, Part 1 of the Lives of the Three Misses Judsons, by Arabella M. Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, War with the British. Narrative of the sufferings of the missionaries during the war. In 1824, news reached America of the breaking out of war between Burma and British India. This, of course, excited the most anxious interest for the fate of the Americans in that country. At length, anxiety was somewhat relieved by the intelligence that Messrs. Wade and Hugh, with their families, had remained at Rangoon, were, after dreadful sufferings, safe under British protection. But over the fate of Mr. and Mrs. Judson hung the silence of death, or of a suspense worse than death, for more than 2 years, until hope itself died in the hearts of their friends and kindred. But although in this long period of doubt and darkness, busy fancy had pictured many scenes of terror and many forms of violent death as the possible lot of the missionaries, yet in her wildest nights she could never have conceived of the terrible reality which they endured, not for days and weeks only, but for 18 weary months. The wildest tale of fiction has never depicted more cruel anguish, more appalling suffering, borne with more heroic energy and more sublime fortitude. The wildest fiction would not dare to portray woman's love and faith and Christian hope, so long triumphant over insult and outrage, and torture and death itself. Who, after reading the following narrative of a heroic female's unparalleled endurance, will ever say that woman's is a feeble nature, incapable of withstanding the rude shocks of adverse fortune? Nay, who will not rather say that in woman, hope and faith and fortitude and energy make even the frail body immortal, till her labor of love is accomplished, and its cherished object is rescued from peril? The war which now broke out between the Burman government and that of English in Bengal forms an important era in the history of the mission. Its first effect was to put an end to the labors of missionaries and involve them in unspeakable sufferings, yet in accordance with the mysterious though beneficent law of human affairs. Its ultimate issues have proved favorable not only to the interest of that particular mission, but also to the further extension of Christian civilization among the thickly peopled countries of eastern India. The war had its origin in feuds which had long existed on the frontiers of Chittagong. Some Burman criminals had escaped to that territory, where, as it was alleged, they were protected by British power. The Burman monarch determined to chastise the English by making war on their government, and had raised 30,000 troops under the command of his greatest warrior, Bandula. But the East India Company anticipated his movements and landed their forces at Rangoon so suddenly and unexpectedly that the city fell into their hands with scarcely a show of resistance. This was the first news that reached Ava of the commencement of the hostilities. It surprised the court there, but by no means alarmed them, neither having come into collision with the English, and having the most extravagant conceit of their own invincibility. They did not for a moment doubt their power to drive the invaders from their country, and even set by one of their generals a pair of golden fetters with which to chain the governor general and to bring him captive to Ava. The first effect of the intelligence of the war upon the situation of the missionaries was an order that no man wearing a hat should enter the palace. This was somewhat startling. Still nothing of importance occurred for several weeks, during which Mrs. J. continued her school, while her husband went on building a house. But at length, suspicion having been excited that the Englishmen who resided in Ava were spies, they were seized and put in confinement. Dr. Price and Mr. Judson were strictly examined also, but nothing being proved against them, they were left at liberty. They might probably have escaped further molestation had it not been found, in examining the accounts of one of the Englishmen, that he had paid over a considerable money to the missionaries. Ignorant of money transactions as carried on by foreigners, this was evident to the natives, that the teachers were in the pay of the British and probably spies. This being represented to the king, he gave an angry order for their arrest. On the 8th of June, Mrs. Judson's house was rudely entered by an officer, followed by 8 or 10 men, one of whom, by the hideous tattooing on his face, they knew to be the executioner, or son of the prison. On seeing Mr. Judson, "You are called by the king," said the officer, the usual form of arrest. In an instant the spotted-faced man threw him on the floor and drew forth that instrument of torture, the small cord. Mrs. Judson tried in vain to bribe him with money. "Take her too," said the officer. "She also is a foreigner." But this order Mr. Judson prevailed on them to disregard, and was now in confusion and dismay, the children crying, the neighbors collecting around and in the house, while the executioner bound Mr. Judson with the cords, and took a fiendish pleasure in making them as tight as possible. Mrs. Judson gave Moung Ing money that he might follow and procure a mitigation of this torture, instead of which Mr. Judson was again thrown down, and the cords so tightened as almost to prevent respiration. He was hurried on to the courthouse, thence to the death prison, in which he was hurled, and Moung Ing saw him no more. We may imagine the intolerable agony of Mrs. Judson when the faithful disciple returned with the sad news of his master's fate. Retiring to her room, she tried to find consolation in casting her dreadful burden of fear and suspense on her covenant God. But soon her retirement was invaded by the magistrate of the place, who ordered her to come out and submit to an examination. Of course she was obliged to obey, but before doing so she destroyed every writing she possessed, letters, journals, and everything, lest her correspondence with her British friends should confirm the suspicions of their persecutors. When the magistrate had satisfied himself with the examination, he placed a guard of 10 ruffians about the house, with orders that no one should leave it on pain of death. Taking her 4 little Burman girls into an inner room, she barred the door, and obstinately refused to come out, though the guard, bent on tormenting her, threatened to break down the door if she did not. She prevented this outrage by a threat to the complaint of their conduct in the morning to higher authorities. But in revenge they bound her 2 Bengali servants fast in the stocks in a most painful posture. By bribes and promises she at length induced them to release the servants, but their dreadful carousings and horrid language, combined with her suspense in regard to her husband's fate, rendered that long night one of unmitigated wretchedness. In the morning Moung Ing, whom she had sent to the prison, returned with the intelligence that all white foreigners were in the death prison, chained with 3 pairs of fetters to each a pole, to prevent their moving. The point of anguish was now, she says, that I was a prisoner myself, and could make no efforts for their relief. She earnestly but vainly begged the magistrate to allow her to go and state the case to some government official. She even wrote a letter to the Queen's sister, who was civil, but afraid to interfere on her behalf. The days, she said, wore heavily away, Another dreadful night was before me. I endeavored to soften the feelings of the guard by giving him some tea and cigars for the night, so that they allowed me to remain inside my room, without threatenings as they did the night before. But haunted by the idea of her dear husband's tortures, she was neither permitted to share or alleviate. She of course passed another night of anguish. The next day she sent a message to the governor of the city to allow her to visit him with a present. This was successful, and the guards had orders to permit her to go into town. She was pleasantly received, stated the situation of the teachers, and assured the governor that being not Englishmen but Americans, they had nothing to do with the war. She was referred to a head officer with whom she might consult, as being means of making the prisoners more comfortable, but their release was out of the question. The first sight of this officer, whose face exhibited the working of every evil passion, inspired her with dread, but he was the only one who could assist her. He took me aside and endeavored to convince me that myself, as well as the prisoners, was entirely at his disposal, that our future comfort must depend upon my liberality in regard to presents, and that these must be made in a private way, and unknown to any officer of the government. What must I do, said I, to obtain a mitigation of the sufferings of the two teachers? Pay to me, said he, 200 ticals, about $100, 2 pieces of fine cloth, and 2 pieces of handkerchiefs. At length, however, he consented to take what money she had about her, which was a considerable sum, and promised to relieve the teachers from their most painful situations. She goes on. I then procured an order from the governor for my admittance into the prison, but the sensation produced by meeting my husband in that wretched, horrid situation, and the scene that ensued, I shall not attempt to describe. He crawled to the door of the prison, for I was never allowed to enter, gave me some directions relative to his release, but before we could make any arrangement, I was ordered to depart by those iron-hearted jailers, who could not endure to see us enjoying the poor consolation of meeting in that miserable place. In vain I pleaded the order of the governor for my admittance. They again harshly repeated, "Depart, or we pull you out." The same evening all the foreigners succeeded, by the payment of money, in being removed from the common prison to an open shed, where Mrs. Judson was allowed to send them food and mats to sleep on, but for some days was not permitted to see them. Nothing but her own eloquent words can do justice for the transactions that followed. We copied as before from her letter, written 2 years subsequent to these events, to her brother-in-law, Dr. Judson. My next object was to get a petition presented to the Queen, but no person being admitted into the palace who was in disgrace with his Majesty, I sought to present it through the medium of her brother's wife. I had visited her in better days, and received particular marks of her favour, but now times were altered. Mr. Judson was in prison, and I in distress, which was a sufficient reason for giving me a cold reception. I took a present of considerable value. She was lolling on her carpet as I entered, with her attendants around her. I waited not for the usual question to a suppliant, "What do you want?" but in a bold, earnest, yet respectful manner stated our distresses and our wrongs, and begged her assistance. She partly raised her head, opened the present I had brought, and coolly replied, "Your case is not singular. All the foreigners are treated alike." "But it is singular," said I. "The teachers are Americans. They are ministers of religion, have nothing to do with the war or politics, and came to Ava in obedience to the king's command. They have never done anything to deserve such treatment. And is it right that they should be treated thus? The king does as he pleases, said she. I am not the king. What can I do? You can state their case to the queen and obtain their release, replied I. Place yourself in my situation. Were you in America, and your husband, innocent of crime, thrown into prison in irons, and you a solitary, unprotected female, what would you do? Without a slight degree of feeling, she said, I will present your petition. Come again tomorrow. I returned to the house with considerable hope that the speedy release of the missionaries was at hand. But the next day the property of Mr. Guger, one of the Englishmen, amounted to $25,000, was seized and carried to the palace. The officers on their return politely informed me that they should visit our house on the morrow. I felt obliged for this information, and accordingly made preparations to receive them by secreting as many little articles as possible, together with considerable silver, as I knew if the war should be protracted, we should be in a state of starvation without it. But my mind was in a dreadful state of agitation, lest it should be discovered, and cause my being thrown into prison, and had it been possible to procure money from any other quarter, I should not have ventured on such a step. The following morning, the royal treasurer, the governor of the north gate of the palace, who was in future our steady friend, and another nobleman, attended by 40 or 50 followers, came to take possession of all we had. I treated him civilly, gave him seats, and tea, and sweetmeats for their refreshment, and justice obliges me to say that they had conducted a business of confiscation with more regard to my feelings than I should have thought it possible for Burmese officers to exhibit. The 3 officers with one of the royal secretaries alone entered the house. Their attendants were ordered to remain outside. They saw I was deeply affected, and apologized for what they were about to do, by saying it was painful for them to take possession of property not their own, but they were compelled thus to do by order of the king. Where is your silver, gold, and jewels? Said the royal treasurer. I have no gold or jewels, but here is the key of a trunk which contains the silver. Do with it as you please. The trunk was produced, the silver weighed. This money, said I, was collected in America by the disciples of Christ, and sent here for the purpose of building a kyong, the name of a priest dwelling, and for our support while teaching the religion of Christ. Is it suitable that you should take it? The Burmans are averse to taking religious offerings, which was the cause of my making the inquiry. We will state this circumstance to the king, said one of them, and perhaps he will store it. But is this all the silver you have? I could not tell a falsehood. The house is in your possession, I replied. Search for it yourselves. Have you not deposited silver with some person of your acquaintance? My acquaintances are all in prison. With whom shall I deposit silver? They next ordered my trunk and drawers to be examined. The secretary only was allowed to accompany me in this search. Everything nice or curious which met his view was presented to the officers for their decision whether it should be taken or retained. I begged that they would not take our wearing apparel, as it would be disgraceful to take clothes partly worn into the possession of His Majesty, and to us they were of unspeakable value. They assented, and took a list only, and did the same with the books, medicines, etc. My little work table, rocking chair, presents from my beloved brother, I rescued from their grasp, partly by artifice, and partly through ignorance. They left also many articles, which were of inestimable value during our long imprisonment. End of chapter 16.